and maybe sometimes earlier. When on this corner was the Bank of America. It was the first branch that allowed black tellers to sit there. Wow. After CORE launched a major campaign against Bank of America.
What years was that?
They finally gave in, and the first black tellers were at this bank, okay? That was kind of the beginning of some meaningful integration into San Francisco, which prided itself as being, as I've said in the film, a very sophisticated city open to all who came here. It was different. This is our home, from Sutter Street all the way back to Hayes, and from Fillmore back to Van Ness, if you're lucky you get close to Van Ness. And going west, if you were able to get to Potrero Avenue, that was kind of what we called the black community in those days. So I happened to be fortunate enough to come on the scene in San Francisco in 1945 as a student of Ansel Adams. As I say with pride, I was the first black student of Ansel Adams. And it's interesting how I got together with Ansel Adams. I had been in the Navy here in San Francisco in 1944. And one night I had liberty, and I got the Greyhound bus, and I came to 7th and Mission. That's where the Greyhound bus station was. Anybody remember that?
Yeah.
Greyhound bus station was there. It's different now. And I got off the Greyhound bus station and said, "Where is the colored section?" And the guy said, "You take the B car line and you get off of Fillmore and Geary. That's it." And that's what I did as a young sailor in the Navy. And then I walked up and down Fillmore Street. Hustlers and everybody was there, turning tricks and so forth. "Hey, sailor boy, you want to have a little fun?" and all that. That was my first introduction to San Francisco. And I had no clue that after the war I would return. But by reading a paper, I returned to San Francisco after I was discharged from the Navy, and went back to San Francisco. To Jacksonville, Florida, where I was born. And I said, now how am I going to study photography? And there are no schools here that I could study with. And so I read this article in a magazine called the Popular Photography Magazine that Ansel Adams was going to open the Department of Photography at the California School of Fine Arts. It's now called the San Francisco Art Institute. And that's kind of how I got started, by studying with Ansel Adams. But an interesting organization existed in San Francisco called the Council of Civic Unity. It doesn't exist anymore. And it was a gentleman there named Ed Howdy. I'll never forget him. Knew that I was studying photography at the School of Fine Art. He didn't have a clue that I was going to be studying documentary photography or anything like that. So he asked me to come down to his office on Post Street. And he says, there's some social problems going on in the Fillmore district. There's slum housing and people aren't getting jobs, and that is a community you should take a look at. So I did. I started going up and down Fillmore Street and start making photographs, meeting young guys like Willie Brown as they were getting started, Garfield Stewart, Terry Francois, Dr. Gullett, people like that were some of the first people I got to know. In fact, Dr. Gullett gave me a job as the press photographer for the Sun Reporter. And that's how, as I mentioned on the film, I got to meet some important people in San Francisco. People who were, there was a lady, I had a radio program called Negro in the News. I forgot her name. She was with a station in Oakland. Oakland always seemed to have the stations that spoke to the black population, whether it was in the East Bay or whether it was in San Francisco. So it was kind of this exposure that sort of frame like in photography, what photographs I would take. So up and down the street, as mentioned in this photograph here, that's on Sutter Street. That's Melrose Record Shop. It was a Jewish guy who ran that record shop, and he was a guy who carried the black recording artists. And the reference to Bilbo, anyone here know the history of Mississippi and Bilbo? He was not a nice guy. And he didn't care for black folk. And he was senator, and he also was the governor of Mississippi. So someone recorded that song after Bilbo died. And I had never heard the song until, about a year ago. I had a show in Atlanta, Georgia, and the curator says, you know, we should Google and see if that song is available. There is a song about Bill Boy dying. So obviously we didn't mourn his death, right? We celebrated his death. If you look at it, that sounds a little cold, but Bill Boy had a kind of a cold program for black people. So that's how that photograph, that was a kind of a historical meeting place right here. And I was walking down Sutter Street and I noticed the sign, and that sort of attracted me to the group of guys. It was not typical to have brothers standing on a corner, hitting on chicks and find out, hey, what's going on? You know, that's changed now, of course, you realize. That's changed now. So that's how I happen to be attracted to that particular scene. And the Chronicle runs it every now and then that photograph is, and it's very popular because historically Maya Angelou worked in this record store. I didn't realize that until later. When she was writing her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, she worked in that store. So with scenes like this, it came to my attention. Now notice now, I'm not talking about Ansel Adams' influence of going to Yosemite, taking landscapes. In the first place, I didn't know where Yosemite was. In fact, I could hardly pronounce it. I thought it was Yosemite or San Jose. So I never quite made it. In fact, I only saw Yosemite really several years ago when I took some of my grandkids up there. It's a beautiful place. But by that time in my career, I'm sold on photographing black people with dignity and respect. And I think you'll see that in the book, and you hopefully saw it somewhere in the film. So that's kind of how I got started in this game. And always, it was the Fillmore district that was my turf. I didn't have far to go. I lived up on Divisadero Street, so all I had to do was come down here. And also, you know where Safeway is now?
On Church?
Safeway Market. Currently, it's the Safeway Market in our neighborhood. That's where there were some storefront businesses there, and there was a church there called Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church. While I was in the Navy, I visited that church. Some girl saw me roaming down the street, and I started talking to her. And she said, "Why don't you come to church?" Church? Yeah, I'll come to church. So that's how I met her. And when I returned from the service, I had friends in San Francisco. So I looked up some people who were affiliated with the church, and they helped me find a place to live. And during that time, I took a photograph of the minister, and I took a photograph of a little boy that's in the book named Clance. And that photograph, the story of that photograph is some of my colleagues said to me, "David, that's a nice photograph of little boy Clance. Why don't you submit it to the Chronicle?" And I made mention of that in the film. And I submitted it to the Chronicle, and the Chronicle made it Picture of the Week and paid me a small sum of money. But I was beginning to see, well, the eye that you have and the images that you choose have some value to yourself, and it appears that you're having a broader audience. People like the work. And I can't say I had a plan when I went out to photograph. What came to my attention were photographs that attracted to me. For an example, and the book people here will appreciate this. I went up on the Bank of America was doing a refitting of the storefront, painting it or something, and there were scaffolds there. So I went up on that scaffold with a big camera on my shoulder, a 4x5 view camera, and I made that photograph of looking down Fillmore Street. How many of you have seen that photograph? It's in the book. It's a fantastic. Now, little did I know I was making a historical photograph. It's where Japantown and Blacktown sort of came together.
Yeah.
And, you know, it says a lot about the community. And the stores that were along Fillmore Street, you can see those. Because many of the businesses, small businesses, that relocated here after the earthquake were still in existence along Fillmore Street. And there were hardly any black merchants there. Hardly. None, as a matter of fact. So that's what I began to photograph. And they became important icons for the future, which is what you saw. So that's how my photography life evolves. I met some interesting people, I met some people who were famous. I didn't know they were famous, and they taught me. People like Lisette Modell and Dorothea Lange and Edward Weston. And these people are icons in the world of photography. Those of you know a little bit about the history of photography. I happened to meet Gordon Parks, and luckily for me, I had an exhibit in Oakland. No. Lucky for me, someone in an office saw this photograph of Clarence that I was describing to you and thought that photograph would be good in the show that was being put on for Gordon Parks. It's called Half Past Autumn, and it was in Oakland. So she contacted me and said, would you participate in the show that we're having for Gordon Parks? I said, I'd be delighted to do so. So not only did I exhibit that picture of Clarence, they asked me to be one of the number of photographers in the community who would also hang their work while Gordon Parks had his work there. So Gordon Park was always an inspiration to me. And when I was in school, we gave a seminar. You talk about somebody in photography, so I chose Gordon Parks. That's when I started reading about him and his life. So it was really a pleasure to finally, later in my life, get to meet him and exhibit my work along with his. So where am I today? I'm just going to cut to the chase. Where I am today is telling the story. Now those of you who are students of West Africa know the term griot, right? A griot is a storyteller, as I understand it. And in the African culture in West Africa, it was a griot that told the story to the future generations about what the past was like, what the hunting season was like. He was kind of like the prime minister to the chief. And if you go online and look up griot, that's kind of... So a few weeks ago, after a few shows, I discovered that I should call myself a griot. I'm a modern griot. Everything in this photograph, in this book, has already happened. That corner, Fillmore and Gary,